Today's topic is going to be life history evolution. So life history strategies are species-specific strategies associated with when an organism will invest in growth, reproduction, timing of maturity, how many eggs to lay, and the goal is to maximize lifetime reproductive success. So lifetime reproductive success molds different life history strategies. So we'll talk about the variation of those in birds, and this is going to tie together a lot of what we've been talking about in the past with regard to bird reproduction and mating systems and nesting ecology, and then it's going to tie nicely into the topics we're going to be covering soon, namely population ecology and how that varies in birds, and then go directly into conservation biology. And life history evolution plays a big role in the challenges and the potential for species that are endangered to be able to rebound, as we'll see. So, why do species like the four shown here show such a great range in clutch sizes and reproductive efforts and lifespans? So on the top left here we have an albatross that may lay a single egg every other year. Okay, you think, well, it's a big bird, and maybe that has something to do with it. Well, just below it we have a mallard. Mallards are pretty big birds too, and they can lay very large clutches every single year. So size isn't necessarily the issue, and just to kind of demonstrate that more, in the top right we have spectacled tanager. This is a tropical species of tanager, and they have relatively small clutch sizes compared to a similarly sized bird like an eastern bluebird. Some nesting differences, but really one of the things we'll see that drives this is the predation pressures and the life time reproductive, the lifespan potential differences in the adults of the tanager versus the bluebird here, and predation differences associated with each of the nests. All right, so as I mentioned, life history traits are molded by natural selection so that an individual's lifetime reproductive success is maximized. Remember, that is the key goal for all organisms, to maximize your evolutionary fitness. And so it doesn't matter what you do at a single nesting attempt, it's how many copies of your genes you're passing on for your entire lifetime. And so if you do too much, that may limit the potential that you can do in the future. So we're going to talk a lot about trade-offs. Trade-offs are going to be key in our discussions. So for example, if you try to reproduce at too early of an age, it may limit your lifespan. There's the trade-off associated with that. So it might be better for some species to have the potential for long life, to not put that long life potential in jeopardy by doing something too stressful too early, like reproduction, before you're really ready. All right, so let's just look at some examples of birds that have different life history patterns. So something like an albatross, an eagle, they have fairly decent survival before breeding, but they don't breed until fairly late in life, maybe 8 to 10 years before they become sexually mature. And then once they do reproduce, you see that their fecundity, the number of young that they produce per year, is extremely low. And that's also associated with a very low adult mortality rate. Now compare that to ducks, most passerines, which are relatively small. Their survival before breeding is really low, maybe 15% per year. And so their age at reproduction is first year possible. As soon as they can mature, they do, and they reproduce. Their fecundity, relatively moderate. They may be able to produce 3 young per year on average, but they're going to do this, what we're going to see, with a much larger clutch size. So they're going to lay more eggs. And the reason they're doing this, why they're reproducing so early and really investing a lot in reproduction during that early time frame, is because they don't have a good shot of living long. Their adult mortality rate may be about 50% per year. So these are the contrasting strategies based upon factors such as adult mortality and survivorship at different times of the year, at different times of your lifespan. And again, these are going to influence population growth, population density. Environmental conditions are going to have a feedback on things like adult mortality and nesting mortality. So all of these things are going to be tied together in this lecture and future lectures. So what is the life expectancy of birds? Again, passerines, not very good. You know, they have about a 50% shot of making it from 1 year to the next once they reach sexual maturity on average. Some of them can live for a decent period of time, but you know, about 10 years would be a good lifespan for something like a northern cardinal, mockingbird, or brown thrasher. Although there are records of some getting up into the late teens, maybe early 20s, in some species that have been studied for long periods of time. Now, as you get into some of the larger birds, you do tend to see a greater propensity to live longer. So one of the classic examples of this, and it's kind of misrepresented actually in this figure here, is Procellariforms. There's a Laysan albatross that has been named Wisdom. And Wisdom, last time I checked, was 68 years old and still reproducing. So she tends to lay an egg and attempt to raise an offspring every other year, and is currently in the late 60s, maybe 70 at this point. But so these averages are probably underestimates of the maximum possible, because that's hard to collect data on. All right, so let's talk about how things like mortality can affect the evolution of age-specific fecundity, or what should your reproductive effort be at different ages, and how different species will have different fecundity investment based upon their mortality. So, for example, let's just kind of look at this graph and see if you can predict what's going to go on here. Let's say that you have really high annual mortality. Should you reproduce very few young, or should you reproduce a lot of young? Okay, let's look at the opposite of that. Let's say that you have a high chance of survival, very low mortality. Should you reproduce a lot? Which, if that's going to stress you out too much, that might put you at risk for increased mortality, so you may not want to do that. Or would you want to kind of take it easy and try to spread out, given that the fact that you might live a long time, spread out that reproductive success over a number of years. So I think I've kind of hit on the expected pattern here, that we should expect this to be a curve, a line, a positive slope here. And this is what the data show, looking at various species. So fecundity is directly proportional to annual mortality. Okay, let's look at another way of looking at this and see if you can, again, predict what's going to happen here. So this is data from different species in the genus Paris, the tits. And if you look at the relationship of eggs per pair per breeding season and how that relates to adult survivorship, do you think that large clutches are associated with high survivorship or low survivorship? And those that produce low clutches, are they associated with high survivorship or low survivorship? Well, as you might expect, the pattern is reverse of what we just talked about, such that if you have relatively low survivorship, you better produce as many as you can while you have the opportunity. You are alive, you better produce as many as possible. If, however, you tend to have high survivorship, maybe you need to take it easy, right? So it's the same kind of data that we talked about last time, but just graphically presented in a different manner. But I just want you to follow the logic. So, what's the cause and effect here? Does high mortality select for increased effort, Well, in some species that is the case. So certainly for small passerines that just have a lot of ecological mortality, they're more likely to be killed by predators. They're more likely to run into problems during migration. They're just not going to live very long. So there's just nothing that they can really do to do that. So they can't bank on reproducing in the future. They need to reproduce as much as they can, as quickly as they can. For other species, the second point here, perhaps too much effort could cause increased mortality. Okay, so if you have the potential to live for a long period of time, don't stress yourself out. Don't try to do too much too early, because it may, trying to do too much too early, you may reproduce successfully, but if it reduces your lifespan, it may also reduce your lifetime reproductive success. And that there is evidence for this for a species called the black-legged kittiwake. If you look at their survival in situations where there is reduced clutch size versus enlarged clutch sizes, which were made extra large to make the birds work harder in an experimental study versus a control, you can see that not as much for males, but certainly for females, it significantly reduced their survivalship. So a female black-legged kittiwake forced to work extra hard has reduced survival. So how does this affect life history evolution? Well, you wouldn't expect them to evolve to normally have large clutches then, because you can clearly see that there would be a cost associated with that. And interestingly, you see that when you reduce their clutch size, you might get a slight increase in survivalship, but not enough where it's where there's a big difference between the controls here. So this basically says they're really riding the edge. They're producing a clutch size that will maximize, that is meeting that trade-off between survivalship, so that you live a long time, but you can also produce a substantial number of young, or a decent number of young each year, to maximize your lifetime reproductive success. You wouldn't really gain much in lifespan by reducing your clutch, and over those years, it probably would end up lowering your lifetime reproductive success. So natural selection really has molded them to hit that balance between survival and reproductive effort per year. All right, so age of maturity decreases with increased mortality associated with adults. So the idea here is that if you have high annual mortality rates, you should breed really early. As soon as you can, you should reproduce. If you, as a species, have relatively low annual mortality rate, it might be better to delay reproduction, and that way you're better set for having more years of good reproductive success. So passerines would be down here, right? So they're not going to live a long time. Breed your first year, produce a large clutch, and perhaps even multiple clutches per year, because you just don't have a lot of time. Something like a wandering albatross, you're going to be up here, right? So mature at 8 to 11 years, and then spread your reproductive effort out over those years. Don't try to do too much in any one year. As a matter of fact, they tend to have one chick per every 2 years. And again, that they might live for 50 years as opposed to just a few years that a passerine would. So we're going to have a line like this. And sure enough, there it is. All right, so which of these strategies is better? You know, it's kind of like the rabbit or the hare tale. Is a sparrow strategy versus a penguin strategy, kind of like the example of the passerine versus the albatross strategy, which of these gives you maximum lifetime reproductive success? Well, they're actually comparable. If you look at the area under the curve, here looking at age and annual fecundity that is based upon your age-specific fecundity, your age-specific survivorship is LX, age-specific fecundity is BX. So if you combine those, you get your annual mortality, and you see that sparrows don't live long, but in those early years, they reproduce at a high rate. Penguins have the potential to live a long time, so they'll delay reproduction compared to the sparrows. And then when they do reproduce, they'll spread that out over this longer time period. But if you actually integrate the area under this curve versus that curve, it's actually similar. So one of the things that we'll talk about when we talk about population growth potential and population ecology, when you're doing a study trying to understand the factors that may lead to a population increasing or decreasing, which is particularly important for an endangered species, you can use life tables. Life tables track age-specific survival and fecundity to try to understand what's happening with the population. Is it increasing or decreasing? So let's look at this study on screech owls in two different habitats, a suburban habitat and a rural habitat. And the first thing you may notice here is if you look at the age classes, the suburban habitat, these birds they can live up to 10 years, versus the rural habitat, their lifespan is about half of that. All right, well, let's look at their survival probability at each of these ages. Okay, so age-specific survival, probability of survival, and the percent remaining after each cohort. So we start off with a cohort that's 100% of the individuals, and then you see if this is the probability of survival, then what number are we going to have remaining? And I have to tell you right now that I took this from another textbook that has made some mistakes here. So if that's your probability of survival, this number should be 0.36. So that's the percentage that remains off of a cohort. Again, that's just 36% of 100%. But then now we have about half the survival rate for here. Okay, so 0.36, that'll get you 0.18. And then you see that the probability of survival actually increases once you kind of reach that stable adult age in this population. All right, well, let's look at how that relates now to the average number of fledglings that you can produce. And we generally just count female offspring because they're the ones that actually are reproducing in the population. And if you're assuming an even sex ratio, this is the best estimate of what the population's potential to reproduce is. So again, because we made a mistake here, I had to correct this. So we're going to take the LXBX curve, right? So the survival plus the age-specific fecundity. So that's this number times this number to get you 0.29. And then as we follow this population down, we see that, so this is at each age, what are you contributing to the population? What is the number of offspring that are produced? And you see that these later stages, they're really not doing anything. Okay, so they're really not producing anything into the population because there are just too few individuals in the population. So they're not really contributing much to the population's potential growth. So if you add all of this up, this tells us the reproductive potential of this population. It's 0.92. This is almost a stable population. You really, for this to be a stable population where birth rates and death rates are equal, this should be a number of 1. Well, let's compare this to the rural habitat. Again, using the same calculations, you see that their R is only 0.52. And if you look at where that contribution is, yes, these live longer, but this really isn't the story. This isn't really what's contributing to this. It's the earlier reproductive effort In the suburban habitat, look at how much of that's contributed in the first 3 years versus the first 3 years here. Each of these numbers is smaller, particularly the second year, 0.23 versus 0.12, and then 0.15 to 0.1. This is really tells us the story. It's not necessarily that the individuals in the suburban habitat live longer. It's at the earlier stages, they're just having much higher contributions to the population, and that's contributing to the greater success of the suburban habitat versus the rural habitat. And see, this is the information you need to make objective decisions with regard to saying preserving habitats, if one habitat is more productive than others, or understanding how you should manage habitats based upon life history data. Another way of looking at life history data, life history table data, is graphically. So if you look at the age of bird of a species, in this case we're looking at Florida scrub jays and their survivorship, we start off with a cohort again. Everybody's hatched at this point. How many of those make it to successfully be nestlings? So they're just eggs laid versus those that actually hatch. You see a reduction. How many of those live to be fledglings? So they actually leave the nest. How many of them then become independent birds? Remember, this is a cooperative breeding species, so they're helpers in the first year. And you see that these are periods. Remember, we talk about this when we talk about just basic nesting biology. There's a lot of mortality associated with these. So you see a very steep drop in survivorship during these early life history phases. Once you, however, get to become a breeder, you see that there's pretty much increased survivorship. So your probability of making it to the next stage is much greater. Now, there are two different lines here. One is for males, one is for females. Females have this extra dip in mortality because they tend to disperse earlier than males from their natal territory, and that's associated with an extra cost associated with lifespan. But once you do disperse, if you do so successfully and establish a territory or become associated with the territory as a helper, well, in this case it is all breeders. Once you become associated with a breeding territory, males and females have comparable survivorship roles. But again, this initial dip in females is due to that earlier and also longer distance dispersal, which is just more dangerous. All right, so let's make some comparisons of the factors associated with when individuals of a species should start breeding. Again, long-lived species that have the potential to live a long time may actually be constrained to delay reproduction. There may have been selection for slower maturation rates. So they may be physiologically immature and just not capable of breeding early on. And that's because of past selection, because of these life history pressures. They also may lack feeding and anti-predatory skills so that they can't breed successfully or early on, even if they were physiologically capable of doing so. And in these circumstances, particularly if it's a social species, they tend to signal that they are immature and they're not reproductively capable yet. This avoids aggression with other individuals of their species, so it reduces agonistic interactions. It's an effective signal saying, don't pick on me, I'm not a reproductive threat to your fitness at this point. And even when it's physically possible to breed, it may not be in the best interest of your lifetime reproductive success again. These are data from short-tailed shearwaters showing that individuals that have little years of experience also have very little success as far as eggs that actually produce young. They don't actually become fairly successful and kind of comparably successful with age until they're 6-7 years old. Before that, they're just not very successful. And if you try to do too much here, one, you're not being very successful, and you may be putting such a stress on your reproductive physiology that it increases your chances of mortality. And so in the long term, it's decreasing your lifetime reproductive success. This has also been demonstrated in peregrine falcons. Older peregrine falcons also show a pattern like the shearwaters. They're more successful. And so in mating decisions, young peregrines are more successful when they're mated with older birds. And so it could actually impact mate choice. Just wanted to mention a life history pattern that is seen in some organisms called senescence. And this is when you see late life declines in reproductive capability that are also tied with increased mortality rates later in life. This is not really a case for many species of birds because birds tend to just not have very long lifespans, and so there's not potential to show senescence in some species. Particularly in small species that have this high annual, just what we call ecological mortality, like most passerines. But here is a species, the Eurasian sparrowhawk, that is showing senescence, showing that with early on, again, you may have low reproductive capabilities. You kind of reach your peak at 4 to 5 years old, but then you see a decline. Oh, sorry. Let's go over here to reproductive success. Same basic pattern. Success is low initially, then you kind of reach your peak, and then you're just not really successful if you live long enough in late age. You're just not as successful at reproducing. And this is linked to the same pattern in survival. And this drop in yearly reproductive success means that there really isn't selection for you to live longer. Because if you're not really contributing significantly to your lifetime reproductive success, you're already evolutionarily dead. There's no natural selection to live longer if you're not really increasing your fitness. And that's one of the key patterns when you do see senescence in organisms. All right, so we've been talking about when to reproduce. Let's kind of focus more on how much, when you do reproduce, how much effort do you put into it? And one of the most important initial investments is just how many eggs to produce. So what is the optimal clutch size? This was a big area of study back in the 1940s to 60s. Probably more of the 60s, 1960s, looking at what we call optimal clutch size. And one of the patterns that was seen for many species is that if you look at the overall population average clutch size, it's smaller than what is really the most productive clutch size. So if we look here in this figure, this is data from Great Tits. The survivors per brood, so it's basically how successful that nest was in producing offspring. It was actually better for relatively large clutches. So at about 10, that's really where your peak is. But if you actually looked at the average clutch size in the population, it was closer to 8.5. So it's lower than that. And again, this is all tied to lifetime reproductive success. This figure right here is only talking about the survivorships per brood, per nesting attempt. And yes, if you just did one nest, you better lay 10, right? Because that's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. But again, if you do that, the chances of you surviving in the next year is reduced, such that it's actually better for you to take it just a little bit easier. Don't lay quite as many eggs. There's that initial investment in energy and nutrient to produce those eggs, but then also feeding all those extra young. If you take a break just a little bit, it increases your chance of living longer and having more clutches in your lifetime. And so that's the best strategy for maximizing lifetime reproductive success. And this has been shown for many species of birds. So common eaters, if you give more eggs to their clutch, To incubate artificially, there is a clear cost to the individuals that have these increased clutches. They lose mass more quickly. They are more likely to get sick because they have reduced immune functions. And sure enough, it costs them the next year. They lay fewer eggs in the next year because they're not in peak physical condition. Eastern bluebirds, the same thing. If you compare enlarged clutches versus reduced clutches that have been experimentally manipulated, the males, the next year, their plumage isn't as bright, and this is a species that has the potential to be polygynous, and so they're less likely to attract multiple females to their territories, and so that's going to affect their lifetime reproductive success negatively if they were forced to overdo it in the previous year. Here's another study demonstrating this with American kestrels. If you look at the left here, you see that for both males and females, if you have a relatively large number of young, past say 5, man, your annual survivorship really plummets. Okay, so as long as you're doing about 5 or fewer, you have a relatively constant survivorship. It starts to really drop though at 5 here. And clearly it's more costly for females just from the get-go. It's just more costly, the reproductive potential, just because they're producing the eggs. Well, in this study, they, again, experimentally manipulated clutches. They had reduced clutches and enlarged clutches. And if you looked at how this affected survivorship, those with enlarged clutches in the next year had much higher mortality rate, so their proportion surviving really dropped. But if you look at the reduced versus the control groups, really no significant difference. And again, this is indicating that they've already been programmed by natural selection. They've already been fine-tuned by natural selection to lay appropriate clutch sizes. They're just running that edge of, say, around 5, where they're maximizing what they can do in that 1 year without a substantial cost to their survivorship. And if you reduce their clutches, so you put them more over here, it's really not gaining them much in survivorship. And they're actually losing maybe one young, so that would actually be a negative to their lifetime reproductive success. So this again is just telling us that the birds really, natural selection has molded them to lay clutch sizes that are appropriate to maximize lifetime reproductive success. Well, if you look at species that show large geographic ranges, you do, however, see that there can be a huge range in clutch sizes. So in northern flickers, for example, in some populations you have very large clutches, other populations you have very small clutches. What could explain this geographic variation? Is it random, or is there some selective force that could explain this variation? Well, across a number of species, this is the typical pattern that you see, that with increasing latitude, you get increasing clutch sizes. And that's also, again, true for the northern flicker. And there are several hypotheses that have been proposed to explain this pattern, so that the farther north you go, the larger the clutches. David Lack proposed the idea that because you have more daylight hours, and biparental care is so important, that it just gives the parents more time to collect food for their young, and so they can take care of a larger clutch. The problem is this is the same pattern for nocturnal species, in which case it's actually the opposite as far as just time available to feed young. So that doesn't necessarily, that hypothesis does not have a lot of support. Ashmole's hypothesis states that this trend is associated with, as you go farther north, you get a better seasonal superabundance of resources that are just temporarily available. So if you look at what resources are available to maintain the adult population through the low point of, say, the winter in the northern region, the seasonal abundance that you get of insects and primary productivity is much greater the farther north you go, the longer the days are, and so you get this super abundant production of resources, but in a very narrow window of opportunity. Compared to tropical species, and there could be different curves associated with tropical species, but the magnitude of the seasonally high reproduced resources, say in the dry season or the wet season, depending on the species, isn't that big of a difference between what is just the baseline level at the low point of the season. And there is support for Ashmole's hypothesis. Again, if you look at plant primary productivity, which again is the base of the energy pyramid, so even if the birds are not eating the plants themselves, they could be eating insects that are feeding on those plants. So the greater the primary productivity, the greater the trophic energy available at different trophic levels. And sure enough, as you go north, the greater these values are, and it's associated with larger clutch sizes in these 5 different bird communities as far as the average clutch size. There's a third hypothesis, Scutch's hypothesis, and this doesn't necessarily have to counter, it's not contradictory to Ashmole's hypothesis. They're not mutually exclusive. But the idea here is that clutch size decreases with increased predation threat at the nest and increased adult survivorship. So the idea here is that high predation at the nest selects for smaller clutches, particularly in the tropics. So if you look down here at Argentina, they have really high nest predation rates. And as that nest predation rate increases, you have smaller clutch sizes. Same pattern also exists in the temperate zone, but tropical nests just in general have much higher nest predation rates. So this relationship, the shapes of these curves are the same, but it's greatly depressed for the tropical species because of this daily predation rate. Nests just get hit really hard. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. That's basically what's going on here. Another thing associated with this that I mentioned, the other thing was increased adult survivorship. Again, if you have the potential to live a long time, you don't want to make too large of a clutch because it may reduce your probability of survival. All right, well, let's look at this advantage. So let's look at why small clutches in high predation threat environments may be beneficial. Well, one is a small clutch. If you're just laying 2 to 3 eggs, it's a lot faster than producing a clutch of, say, 6 to 7 eggs. It just takes, there's less time those eggs are available for predators to find. Once they hatch, again, there's going to be less noise, less commotion associated with a smaller clutch with fewer nestlings, and you have to bring less food less frequently to this nest, so you're less likely to tip off the location of the nest to a potential predator. The other thing is that in these tropical species, each nest may have relatively few eggs put in it, so a smaller clutch size, but they may nest multiple times. And so you're spreading out the risk, the predation jackpot, by not putting all your eggs in one basket. And sure enough, if you look here to support this third pattern here, as the daily predation rate increases, the food delivery rate decreases. So if you have a lower predation rate, you can get away with delivering more food to young, and you can have a larger clutch. So you would have to do this if you have a large clutch. And here, if we just look at a comparison of tropical species versus just 3 different warbler species. If you look at the visitation rate, sure enough, those that have higher visitation rates tend to draw more attention to predators than successful nests that can potentially hide from predators. So there is a strong reason to believe that minimizing predation rate could be linked to a visitation rate. Now, this is what I was about to get to in the last figure. There's a really cool study that paired close relatives that live in the temperate zone versus the tropical zone. So 3 parulid warblers, a thrush, a robin, some flycatcher, a wren, and 2 sparrows here. And in all cases, you see that the temperate zone species, their attentiveness, their time that the adults would spend on the nest is much higher compared to their tropical counterparts. And again, this is because the tropical species, the adults have the potential for a longer lifespan. They don't want to invest too much into each individual nest, because if that one nest fails, no big deal. They have the chance to nest again that year, and they have the potential to live longer. And again, they're also put less into each nest because they have smaller clutch sizes, so they have less to lose with those small clutch sizes. So what I'm describing here is what we call a risk-averse strategy. They're minimizing the risk associated with each individual nest to maximize their lifespan. The temperate zone species, remember, the adults don't live as long here. They have to put larger investment into each individual clutch. And once you've done that, put that investment in, you also better invest more time on that nest to make sure that those young are successful, because that really is your strategy, to invest early and to invest much greater intensity. And again, just linking that to adult mortality, again, you see a clear pattern here of temperate zone species versus tropical species. The tropical species tend to have much lower mortality, and again, that is what is linking their smaller attentiveness. They don't want to risk too much associated with those nests, because it may push them to higher adult mortality. These guys, they already have really high mortality estimates, so just go all in with your nest and be very attentive to increase the chance that those young are going to survive. All right, so I did mention that in some cases, species will produce multiple broods per reproductive season. Whether a species does that or not depends on the habitat that they're living in and how long their reproductive season is. So we've already talked about in migratory species, oftentimes they don't have this potential. They have one shot at a nest, or maybe one re-nest attempt, but they're never going to be able to pull off 2 successful broods. But even for resident species, whether you do have multiple broods or not, could be, again, depending on how long the season is, the quality of your territory versus neighboring territories. Again, I've already talked about migratory versus resident species. And also just how long does it take to pull off a clutch. So species that have longer incubation periods, longer periods of trying to bring food to nestlings, and longer fledgling period before they're independent, that could limit the number of reproductive cycles you could have in a year. And again, the longevity of the species is going to affect the trade-offs in lifetime reproductive success. Remember, some species that have really high longevity potential may not even breed every year. They may trade off years for reproducing and then recovery years like the albatross. So certainly for species that have a long lifetime potential, producing multiple broods and really stressing yourself out in one year, that may cost you too much in increased mortality potential. Another thing that may affect the potential for multiple broods is how easy is it to transition from one brood to another. If you're having to feed fledglings, you may not have the potential to also be laying eggs and incubating young at the same time. So that may prevent multiple broods. Again, it kind of depends on how seasonal, how much time you have to do these things. And then breeder age and experience may play a role too. Young birds may not be able to do this successfully, produce multiple broods. It may, again, be too stressful and increase their mortality. But as you age and gain in experience and efficiency, you may be able to pull off this overlapping broods, and the cost may not be prohibitive, so that it actually does significantly increase your reproductive success. Okay, so I know that's some complex material, so please send me any questions you have about that information. And we're going to be talking about these lifetime reproductive strategies as they can possibly impact the population ecology of birds, and then go into talking about conservation biology of birds.